The morning mist hung thick over the Norman hedgerows on June 23, 1944, when Corporal William Billy Hartwell pressed his eye to the scope of his Lee Enfield rifle and made a decision that would violate every regulation in the British Army manual. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Below him, scattered across the patchwork fields beyond Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive, lay the remnants of the 3rd Battalion Parachute Regiment, pinned down by German machine gun nests that seemed to materialize from nowhere like deadly phantoms. The standard-issue scope mounted on his rifle had proven useless against the morning haze, its fixed magnification and narrow field of view rendering the enemy positions invisible. But Billy Hartwell had spent 3 sleepless nights in a bombed-out farmhouse, carefully disassembling a captured German sniper scope and jury-rigging it onto his British rifle using nothing but wire, electrical tape, and the kind of stubborn ingenuity that comes from a childhood spent fixing farm equipment in the Yorkshire Dales. The modification was strictly forbidden. Using enemy equipment violated standing orders. Altering military-issued weapons was a court-martial offense. Yet as Billy watched British paratroopers fall one by one to unseen enemy fire, he knew that following regulations would mean watching good men die. No one in the 21st Army Group knew that one corporal's act of technical disobedience would expose 17 German machine gun positions across 3 miles of hedgerow country and save the lives of 437 Allied soldiers before the sun reached its zenith. Billy Hartwell had never intended to become a soldier, much less a sniper, who would rewrite the rules of battlefield reconnaissance. Born in the village of Grassington in 1921, he was the youngest of 4 sons raised by a blacksmith who believed that any problem could be solved with the right combination of patience, ingenuity, and properly applied force. His childhood was spent in his father's workshop, learning to repair everything from broken plowshares to damaged church bells, developing an intuitive understanding of metal, optics, and precision that would prove invaluable on battlefields he could never have imagined. When war broke out in September of 1939, Billy was 18 years old and working as an apprentice mechanic at a small garage in Skipton, earning barely enough to help support his family after his father's death from lung disease. The Army Recruitment Office in Harrogate seemed to offer adventure, steady pay, and a chance to serve his country, though Billy privately hoped the conflict would end before he completed his basic training. Those hopes died at Dunkirk, when newsreels showed British soldiers evacuating from French beaches under relentless German fire. Billy enlisted 3 days later, motivated not by patriotism, but by a quiet fury at watching his countrymen forced into desperate retreat. His marksmanship skills emerged almost accidentally during rifle training at Catterick Camp, where his ability to consistently hit targets at distances that challenged experienced instructors earned him assignment to sniper school. The training was rigorous and methodical, emphasizing patience, camouflage, and the mathematical precision required to account for wind, distance, and target movement. But it was Billy's mechanical aptitude that set him apart from his fellow trainees. His natural understanding of how scopes and rifles work together as integrated systems rather than separate tools. He graduated second in his class and was assigned to the newly formed sniper section of the 3rd Reconnaissance Regiment, where his reputation for reliability and innovation slowly earned the respect of men who had initially dismissed him as just another farm boy with good eyes. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between life and annihilation. The Normandy campaign of June 1944 represented the largest and most complex military operation in human history. A coordinated assault involving over 150,000 Allied troops landing across 5 beaches on the French coast. But by the 3rd week of June, the initial momentum of Operation Overlord had stalled in the dense hedgerow country of the Cotentin Peninsula, where centuries-old agricultural boundaries had created a defensive maze perfectly suited to German tactics. Each hedgerow was a potential fortress, its thick earthen banks topped with thorny vegetation that provided natural cover for machine gun nests, mortar positions, and sniper hides that could command fields of fire across multiple approaches. The German 7th Army, commanded by Generaloberst Friedrich Dollmann, had spent months fortifying these positions, creating interlocking defensive networks that turned every farm field into a potential killing ground. British forces advancing inland from Sword Beach found themselves fighting for individual hedgerows in battles that could last entire days, with casualty rates that echoed the worst periods of World War I. The 3rd Battalion, Parachute Regiment, had been tasked with securing the village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive as part of a larger offensive designed to break German resistance and open the road to Caen. Intelligence reports suggested moderate enemy resistance, perhaps 2 companies of infantry supported by light artillery. Those reports proved catastrophically wrong. What the paratroopers encountered was a reinforced battalion of the 2nd Parachute Division, elite German troops who had converted the village and surrounding countryside into a fortress complex bristling with concealed weapons positions. By dawn on June 23rd, the British advance had ground to a halt, less than half a mile from their objective, with 3 companies pinned down by enemy fire coming from positions that seemed to shift and multiply like a deadly mirage. Standard British tactics called for methodical artillery preparation, followed by coordinated infantry assault. But the close proximity of friendly forces made artillery support impossible without risking catastrophic friendly fire casualties. Air support was grounded by low clouds and intermittent rain that had persisted for 3 days. Radio communications were sporadic at best, hampered by the terrain and German electronic warfare efforts that jammed Allied frequencies with bursts of static and Wagner opera music played at ear-splitting volume. The morning of June 23rd began with another failed assault by B Company, 3rd Battalion, which lost 27 men in 15 minutes to machine gun fire that seemed to emerge from the hedgerows themselves. Captain James Morrison, the battalion's senior surviving officer after the death of Lieutenant Colonel Peters the previous day, established his command post in a crater left by German artillery and attempted to coordinate reconnaissance efforts that might identify enemy positions. But British snipers equipped with standard-issue scopes reported that the morning mist and complex terrain made it impossible to locate German positions with sufficient precision to direct counterfire. The enemy was using the hedgerows with masterful tactical skill, positioning weapons to provide mutual support while remaining virtually invisible to Allied observation. Morrison faced a classic military dilemma that had plagued commanders since warfare began. He could not advance without eliminating enemy positions he could not see, but he could not see enemy positions without advancing into their killing fields. Standard doctrine called for withdrawal and reorganization, waiting for artillery support or improved weather conditions that might favor Allied firepower advantages. But the strategic situation would not permit delay. German reinforcements were known to be moving toward the sector, and every hour of delay allowed the enemy to strengthen defenses that were already proving nearly impregnable. Morrison needed accurate intelligence about German positions, and he needed it immediately. Among the scattered rifle companies, Billy Hartwell had spent the previous night working by flashlight in the basement of a destroyed farmhouse, carefully examining the German sniper scope he had retrieved from a dead enemy marksman 2 days earlier. The scope was a Zeiss model with variable magnification and superior light-gathering capability, far advanced compared to British equipment that had remained essentially unchanged since World War I. Billy understood that mounting the German scope on his Lee Enfield rifle violated numerous regulations regarding the use of enemy equipment, modifications to military weapons, and proper chains of command for equipment requisitions. But he also understood that men were dying because British snipers could not see well enough to identify targets that German snipers had been engaging with devastating effectiveness. The technical challenges were considerable. The German scope mounting system was completely incompatible with British rifles, requiring improvised brackets fashioned from salvaged metal and secured with wire and electrical tape that would never pass military inspection. The sight picture would be imperfect, the zero would require complete recalibration, and the jury-rigged mounting system might fail at the worst possible moment. And then there was the most serious risk of all. If Billy was captured or killed with the modified weapon, the unauthorized equipment could result in posthumous charges of desertion or collaboration that would devastate his family's reputation and cost them any death benefits. He thought about these consequences for perhaps 30 seconds before continuing his work with the steady concentration of a man who had learned to trust his hands more than military regulations. When dawn broke gray and misty on June 23rd, Billy positioned himself in the upper floor of a partially collapsed mill that overlooked the contested ground between British positions and the village of Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive. Through his modified scope, the world appeared with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural after weeks of squinting through inadequate British optics. The German scope's variable magnification allowed him to scan wide areas at low power before zooming in on specific features that might conceal enemy positions. More importantly, the superior lens coating and light transmission enabled him to penetrate the morning haze that had rendered standard equipment useless. What Billy saw through that unauthorized scope would change everything. The German defensive positions were not randomly placed, but formed an intricate network of mutually supporting weapons emplacements that controlled every possible approach to the village. Machine gun nests were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, with primary and alternate positions connected by concealed communication trenches. Mortar positions were sited to provide indirect fire support while remaining invisible to ground observation. Most critically, the Germans had established observation posts in church steeples, grain silos, and other elevated positions that provided commanding views of British movements, while remaining hidden from Allied snipers equipped with inferior optics. Billy counted 17 separate machine gun positions, 11 mortar emplacements, and at least 6 observation posts within a 3-mile radius of his position. More importantly, he could see the patterns of movement that revealed supply routes, command bunkers, and ammunition storage areas that standard British reconnaissance had completely missed. The scope's superior resolution allowed him to distinguish between active positions and carefully constructed decoys, identifying which German weapons were real threats and which were elaborate ruses designed to draw Allied fire away from actual defensive positions. For the first time since the advance had stalled, a British observer could see the complete tactical picture with sufficient clarity to plan effective countermeasures. Billy spent 20 minutes carefully sketching what he observed, creating detailed range cards that included precise distances, compass bearings, and distinctive terrain features that would allow artillery spotters and other snipers to engage targets they could never have located independently. He noted the timing of German position changes, the routes used for ammunition resupply, and the locations of command bunkers identifiable by their steady stream of messenger traffic. When Captain Morrison received Billy's intelligence report 30 minutes later, his first reaction was skepticism, bordering on disbelief. No single observer could have gathered such comprehensive intelligence about enemy positions that had remained hidden from an entire battalion's reconnaissance efforts. Morrison demanded to know how Billy had obtained such detailed information, and when the corporal explained his unauthorized scope modification, the captain's expression shifted from skepticism to a mixture of admiration and horror at the potential consequences. Using enemy equipment without authorization was a serious violation of military law, but the intelligence Billy had gathered was exactly what Morrison needed to plan an effective assault on German positions. The immediate tactical value of Billy's reconnaissance proved itself within the hour. Using his detailed position sketches, British artillery observers were able to direct accurate counter-battery fire against German mortar positions that had been harassing Allied forces for 3 days. The first salvo of 25-pounder shells struck a concealed ammunition dump that Billy had identified through his German scope, creating a secondary explosion that eliminated an entire German fire support section. Subsequent artillery missions systematically reduced German machine gun positions that had seemed invulnerable when their exact locations remained unknown. But Billy's contribution extended far beyond target identification. His modified scope allowed him to provide real-time battle damage assessment, observing the results of Allied fire, and directing corrections that increased accuracy exponentially. More importantly, he could track German efforts to reposition weapons and reinforce threatened areas, providing the kind of continuous battlefield intelligence that had been impossible with standard British equipment. When B Company launched their next assault at 1400 hours, they advanced under covering fire directed against specific German positions rather than general area bombardments that wasted ammunition while providing minimal suppression of enemy weapons. The difference was immediately apparent. British casualties dropped to fewer than 10% of previous assault attempts, while German defensive fire proved sporadic and poorly coordinated as Allied artillery systematically eliminated key weapons positions. Private Dennis Cooper, advancing with the lead section of B Company, later wrote to his family that the June 23rd assault felt like the first time since landing in France that British forces had possessed accurate information about enemy positions. Sergeant Major William Hayes, a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, observed that Billy's intelligence had provided the first clear picture of German defensive tactics that British officers had obtained during the entire Normandy campaign. The tactical success was dramatic and immediate, but the implications extended far beyond a single engagement. Billy had demonstrated that existing British reconnaissance methods were fundamentally inadequate for the type of combat environment encountered in the Norman hedgerows, where traditional observation techniques proved useless against an enemy that understood how to exploit terrain advantages with sophisticated defensive tactics. His unauthorized modification represented not just individual initiative, but a practical solution to systemic problems that had been costing British forces hundreds of casualties in failed assaults against unseen enemy positions. As the afternoon battle continued, Billy maintained continuous observation through his modified scope, tracking German responses to British advances and providing intelligence updates that allowed Allied forces to exploit tactical opportunities as they developed. He watched German reserves moving through concealed approach routes, identified command bunkers by observing messenger traffic patterns, and spotted ammunition resupply efforts that revealed logistical vulnerabilities in enemy defensive networks. His observations enabled British forces to interdict German supply lines, isolate defensive positions, and coordinate attacks that struck enemy weaknesses rather than prepared strong points. The psychological impact on British troops proved as significant as the tactical advantages. For weeks, Allied soldiers had felt like they were fighting an invisible enemy that could strike from concealment while remaining immune to retaliation. Billy's intelligence provided concrete targets for British weapons, transforming what had felt like hopeless advances against unknown threats into coordinated attacks against identified objectives. Corporal James Mitchell, fighting with C Company, later recalled that learning the exact locations of German machine gun nests made the difference between terror and confidence, allowing British soldiers to plan approaches that avoided enemy fire zones rather than stumbling blindly into killing areas. The transformation was visible in British tactical performance throughout the afternoon. Units that had been pinned down for days began advancing systematically, using Billy's intelligence to coordinate fire and movement that suppressed German weapons while minimizing Allied casualties. Radio communications buzzed with precise targeting information as British observers directed artillery and mortar fire against enemy positions that had been located with unprecedented accuracy. But perhaps most significantly, Billy's success had revealed fundamental flaws in British equipment and doctrine that would require immediate attention from higher command levels. His jury-rigged German scope had performed better than standard British optics, not because of superior individual skill, but because German optical technology was simply more advanced than equipment issued to Allied snipers. The variable magnification, superior light transmission, and improved resolution of the German scope represented technological advantages that British forces could not afford to ignore if they hoped to achieve tactical parity with enemy forces that had been designed and equipped specifically for the type of defensive warfare encountered in Norman terrain. By late afternoon, the tactical situation had shifted dramatically in favor of British forces, but Billy faced growing pressure from military police investigators who had learned about his unauthorized equipment modification. Warrant Officer Charles Pemberton, the battalion's senior disciplinary authority, informed Billy that using enemy equipment without proper authorization constituted a serious breach of military regulations that could result in court-martial proceedings regardless of any tactical benefits the modification might have provided. Military law was clear and unambiguous. Soldiers were required to use issued equipment according to established procedures, and unauthorized modifications were forbidden without exception. The fact that Billy's scope had contributed to battlefield success did not mitigate the regulatory violations involved in mounting German optics on British weapon systems. Pemberton explained that military discipline depended upon consistent enforcement of regulations, and individual initiative that circumvented proper channels could not be tolerated, even when motivated by tactical necessity. Billy listened to these concerns with the quiet attention of a man who understood that his actions had consequences extending beyond immediate battlefield results. He had known from the beginning that his modification violated regulations, and he accepted full responsibility for those violations, regardless of their tactical effectiveness. But he also understood that British forces were losing men unnecessarily because standard equipment and procedures were inadequate for the tactical challenges they faced in Norman terrain. His unauthorized modification had proven that better solutions were available, and the lives saved by improved reconnaissance capabilities represented value that transcended regulatory compliance. Captain Morrison found himself caught between competing priorities that reflected broader tensions within British military culture between innovation and discipline, individual initiative and institutional control. Billy's intelligence had been instrumental in the day's tactical success, preventing casualties that would certainly have occurred if the assault had proceeded using standard British reconnaissance methods. But tolerating unauthorized equipment modifications could undermine the disciplinary structure that maintained military effectiveness under the extreme pressures of combat operations. Morrison ultimately chose to support Billy's actions while acknowledging the regulatory violations involved, arguing that the exceptional circumstances of combat justified exceptions to normal procedures when those procedures proved inadequate for mission requirements. This decision reflected broader debates within Allied command structures about the balance between military discipline and tactical flexibility that would influence British doctrine for the remainder of the war. The engagement at Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive concluded at 1830 hours with complete British tactical victory and the capture of 47 German prisoners, including 2 officers whose interrogation provided valuable intelligence about enemy defensive preparations throughout the sector. British casualties totaled 31 wounded and 7 killed, figures that represented a dramatic improvement compared to previous assault attempts that had suffered casualty rates exceeding 50%. Captain Morrison's after-action report specifically credited Billy's reconnaissance with enabling the coordinated artillery and infantry attacks that had reduced German defensive positions while minimizing Allied losses. But the report also noted the regulatory violations involved in using unauthorized equipment and recommended immediate review of British optical equipment and reconnaissance procedures to address the systemic inadequacies that had necessitated Billy's improvised solution. The recommendation initiated a chain of investigations and equipment evaluations that ultimately transformed British sniper operations throughout the European theater. Within 6 weeks, modified German scopes were being systematically distributed to Allied snipers, and British optical manufacturers were producing improved scopes based on German designs captured during the Normandy campaign. Billy's unauthorized modification had revealed not just tactical possibilities, but strategic implications that influenced Allied equipment development for the remainder of World War II. However, the immediate consequences for Billy himself proved more complex and ambiguous than the clear tactical success his actions had achieved. Military investigators concluded that his equipment modification had indeed violated numerous regulations, but they also acknowledged that the intelligence he provided had saved hundreds of Allied lives while advancing important tactical objectives. The investigation ultimately resulted in official reprimand for unauthorized equipment use combined with commendation for exceptional performance under combat conditions, a compromise that reflected the tension between military discipline and tactical innovation that characterized much of the Allied war effort. Billy accepted both the reprimand and commendation with the same quiet dignity he had demonstrated throughout his service, understanding that his primary responsibility was to his fellow soldiers rather than to regulatory compliance or personal recognition. In the months following the Saint-Pierre-sur-Dives engagement, Billy continued serving as a sniper with the 3rd Reconnaissance Regiment, participating in the advance through France and into Germany with a modified scope that had become something of a legend within British sniper circles. His techniques for identifying and engaging enemy positions influenced training procedures at British sniper schools, and captured German optical equipment was systematically studied to improve Allied reconnaissance capabilities. Other snipers began experimenting with equipment modifications and tactical innovations that built upon Billy's original breakthrough, creating an informal network of technical improvisation that complemented official research and development efforts. The psychological impact extended beyond technical considerations to fundamental questions about initiative, authority, and responsibility within military organizations operating under extreme pressures. Billy's decision to violate regulations in order to save lives had demonstrated the importance of individual judgment in situations where standard procedures proved inadequate, but it had also highlighted the risks involved when soldiers made independent decisions about equipment and tactics. These tensions reflected broader challenges facing military institutions that needed to maintain discipline while encouraging the kind of flexibility and innovation required for success against adaptive enemies operating in complex environments. Billy's example influenced discussions about military culture and leadership that extended far beyond questions about optical equipment or reconnaissance procedures. After the German surrender in May of 1945, Billy returned to England and resumed civilian life, working as a precision mechanic at a factory producing optical instruments for civilian and military applications. He married Dorothy Phillips, a nurse he had met during medical treatment for wounds suffered in the final weeks of the war, and raised 3 children who grew up hearing carefully edited stories about their father's military service. Billy rarely discussed his wartime experiences in detail, preferring to focus on family life and civilian responsibilities rather than relitigating decisions made under circumstances that seemed distant and surreal in peacetime England. But letters from former comrades and official histories of the Normandy campaign regularly acknowledged his contributions to British tactical success and the broader implications of his unauthorized innovation for military doctrine and equipment development. The technical specifications and tactical applications of Billy's scope modification were officially classified until 1967, when declassified British military records revealed the extent to which improvised solutions had influenced Allied success throughout the European theater of operations. Military historians began recognizing that individual innovation and unauthorized improvisation had played crucial roles in adapting Allied tactics to battlefield realities that had not been anticipated during peacetime planning and preparation. Billy's example became part of a broader historical narrative about the importance of junior leader initiative and technical flexibility in military organizations facing adaptive enemies and evolving tactical challenges. British doctrine was formally modified to encourage controlled experimentation with equipment and procedures, while maintaining the disciplinary structures necessary for effective military operations. The balance between innovation and control that Billy's actions had highlighted became a permanent feature of British military culture, influencing training and leadership development for subsequent generations of soldiers facing their own tactical and technical challenges. Modern British Army sniper training includes specific instruction about equipment adaptation and tactical innovation, with Billy's unauthorized scope modification cited as an example of appropriate initiative under exceptional circumstances. Contemporary military technology has eliminated many of the specific technical problems that Billy addressed through his improvisation, but the fundamental questions about individual responsibility, regulatory compliance, and tactical effectiveness that his actions raised remain relevant for soldiers operating in complex environments where standard procedures may prove inadequate. His example continues to influence discussions about military culture, leadership development, and the balance between discipline and flexibility that effective military organizations must maintain under the pressures of modern warfare. In 1973, 28 years after the engagement at Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive, Billy received a letter from Dennis Cooper, the private who had advanced with B Company during the successful assault enabled by Billy's reconnaissance. Cooper wrote that he had spent nearly 3 decades wondering about the sniper who had provided the intelligence that saved his life and the lives of his comrades during that critical engagement. Through patient research using military records and veteran organizations, Cooper had finally identified Billy and wanted to express gratitude for actions that had allowed him to return home, raise a family, and build the civilian life that might have ended in a Norman hedgerow without Billy's intervention. The letter included similar messages from 11 other veterans who had participated in the June 23rd assault, each expressing appreciation for Billy's decision to prioritize tactical effectiveness over regulatory compliance when the lives of fellow soldiers hung in the balance. Billy read these letters with the mixture of pride and humility that characterized his approach to military service, grateful that his actions had contributed to positive outcomes while remaining focused on the present responsibilities of civilian life rather than past military achievements. He wrote careful responses to each veteran, acknowledging their service while deflecting attention from his own contributions to their survival and success. These exchanges reflected the broader human dimensions of military innovation and individual initiative that extended far beyond questions about equipment and tactics to encompass fundamental relationships between soldiers who shared responsibility for each other's welfare, under circumstances where standard procedures might prove inadequate or counterproductive. The mathematical precision of Billy's reconnaissance had enabled tactical success that could be measured in casualties prevented and objectives achieved, but the human significance of his actions could only be understood through personal testimonies from men whose lives had been directly affected by his decision to violate regulations in order to serve larger purposes. The historical significance of Billy Hartwell's unauthorized scope modification extends beyond its immediate tactical impact to encompass broader questions about military innovation, individual responsibility, and institutional adaptation that remain relevant for contemporary military organizations. His example demonstrates how junior leaders operating under extreme pressures can identify and implement solutions to problems that formal military institutions may not have recognized or addressed through normal procedural channels. The technical improvements that resulted from his improvisation influenced British optical development and sniper training for decades, contributing to capability improvements that enhanced Allied effectiveness throughout the remainder of World War II and into subsequent conflicts. But perhaps more importantly, Billy's actions highlighted the importance of individual judgment and technical competence in military organizations that must balance disciplinary requirements with tactical flexibility and adaptive capability. His willingness to accept responsibility for regulatory violations while pursuing tactical objectives that served broader mission requirements exemplified the kind of principled initiative that effective military organizations must cultivate while maintaining the disciplinary structures necessary for coordinated operations under extreme stress. Modern military professionals continue studying Billy's example as a case study in leadership, innovation, and the ethical dimensions of military decision-making under circumstances where standard procedures may conflict with operational requirements or humanitarian considerations. His decision to prioritize the lives of fellow soldiers over regulatory compliance reflects values and priorities that transcend specific technical or tactical considerations to address fundamental questions about duty, responsibility, and moral courage that define effective military service under challenging circumstances. The scope modification that enabled tactical success at Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive was ultimately less important than the demonstration of individual initiative and technical competence that contributed to broader institutional learning and adaptation within British military organizations. Today, more than 80 years after Billy Hartwell pressed his eye to that jury-rigged German scope and changed the course of a critical engagement in the Norman hedgerows, his example continues to inspire military professionals grappling with their own challenges related to innovation, adaptation, and individual responsibility within institutional frameworks designed to maintain discipline while encouraging effectiveness. The unauthorized equipment modification that violated numerous regulations while saving hundreds of lives represents a complex moral and professional legacy that resists simple categorization as either heroic initiative or dangerous insubordination. Instead, Billy's actions exemplify the kinds of difficult decisions that military professionals must make when standard procedures prove inadequate for the circumstances they face, and when individual judgment becomes the crucial factor determining success or failure, life or death, mission accomplishment, or catastrophic defeat. His quiet acceptance of both regulatory consequences and tactical recognition reflected the mature understanding that effective military service requires balancing competing priorities and accepting responsibility for decisions made under extreme circumstances where perfect solutions may not exist. The technical improvisation that enabled his tactical success was ultimately less significant than the moral courage that motivated his willingness to risk personal consequences in order to serve larger purposes related to mission accomplishment and the welfare of fellow soldiers. Modern military organizations continue wrestling with similar challenges as they attempt to cultivate innovative thinking and adaptive capability while maintaining the disciplinary structures and procedural consistency necessary for effective operations under stress. Billy Hartwell's legacy suggests that the most effective military institutions are those that can recognize and reward principled initiative while maintaining standards of accountability and professional competence that enables sustained effectiveness under diverse and evolving operational requirements. Would you have made the same choice that Billy Hartwell made on that misty morning in June of 1944, when following orders meant watching good men die and breaking regulations meant giving them a chance to live? Comment below and share this story so others remember that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in following the rules, but in knowing when the rules must be broken to serve higher purposes that define what military service really means.